أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا وشفيع ذنوبنا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على ثم الصلاة والسلام على آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المظلومين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من يوم عداوتهم إلى يوم الدين أما بعد فقد قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتابه وهو أصدق القائلين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم واعتصموا بحبل الله جميعا ولا تفرقوا واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ كنتم أعداء فألف بين قلوبكم فأصبحتم بنعمته إخوانا وكنتم على شفا حفرة من النار فأنقذكم منها كذلك يبين الله لكم آياته لعلكم تهتدون صلوات الله محمد. Last night we began discussing the climate in Medina just before and soon after the passing away of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Having discussed first how the Shia emphasize the role of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam and how they seek to prove it from the Quran, we said we will then now look at how history played out in the absence of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Now before we get into this subject tonight, I just want to tie a few loose ends from what we said previously. One was the fact that I mentioned that Ibrahim alayhi salam had prayed to Allah that just as he was submissive to God, he wanted from his descendants an ummah that would be as submissive as him. A question that arises from that is that this ummah that Ibrahim was praying for could have been the prophets that came after him, because most of the Anbiya came after Ibrahim alayhi salam. The answer to that is that in those verses, if you notice, and this is not by coincidence, Allah includes Ismail in it. Ibrahim does not say, "Oh Allah, make me Muslim to you, submissive to you." He says, "Make me and Ismail, Rabbana ja'alna muslimayni lak," both of us. And then when he asks for progeny, he doesn't say وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِي, he says وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِنَا ummatan, from our dhurriya. Now when you look at the prophets and the Anbiya who came, all of them, or the majority, came from the descendants of Ishaq, not from the descendants of Ismail. So all the Anbiya, Musa and Isa and Zakaria and Yahya and Yaqub and Ishaq and Yusuf and Yunus alayhimus salam, they were all descendants of Ishaq. And these came to be known as from the Banu Israel, who were the Jews. The Arabs came from Ismail, and the prophets from Ismail are very few. Some count them as being only 4. They count Ismail himself and the Prophet Hud and Saleh and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali. Furthermore, in those same set of verses, Ibrahim also says, وَبَعَثْ فِيهِمْ رَسُولٍ, and amongst this community of Meccans, send a prophet here who will teach them the book and purify them. Which Allah responds to in Surah Al-Jum'ah by saying, هُوَ الَّذِي بَعَثَ فِي الْأُمِّيِّينَ رَسُولًا, that He sent amongst them a prophet who purified them and taught them the book. So when Allah answers the prayer, He answers it in full. He is talking about the people of Mecca where He sent a prophet. And therefore we must search for this ummatan muslimatan lak from the dhurriya of not just Ibrahim but also Ismail from these Arab descent. That was one. The other thing is, it was pointed out to me that towards the end of the lecture I mentioned in passing that the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam insisted that those who hold authority must be given authority on the basis primarily of being God-fearing, of having taqwa, not of having social standing or having the political acumen. And I mentioned in passing that Amir al-Mu'mineen's policy was, as soon as he got the Khilafat, he asked all the governors from the Umayyads and others to step down and appointed people who were pious. And he was advised against it and told to wait until his government has taken full hold. And in that passing mention, I mentioned Ammar Yasir and I mentioned Salman al-Farisi. So it was pointed out to me that Salman al-Farisi had actually passed away before the time of Imam Ali. As well was pointed out to me that when I mentioned Muawiyah being appointed by the second caliph in Syria, he was first preceded by his brother Yazid bin Abi Sufyan, who was his brother. Now, all this being true though, it does not change the fact that the Umayyads came to power because they were brought into power by the early caliphate, and that Imam Ali alayhi salam tried to reverse this by putting in companions whose integrity and piety was of high standing. So when you read Nahjul Balagha, you will see all these letters where he demotes certain individuals and removes them from power and asks for others to come to power. Now, we continue from where we left, and I began discussing some of the policies of the first caliph, and I won't go into the details of exactly what happened just before the Prophet ﷺ passed away and the whole incident of Raziyat Yawmul Khamis and so on that I have alluded to. I had considered discussing in detail what exactly happened in Saqifa as well, but again I will just summarize it because I think this is something that we have heard time and time again. There is a Sunni narrative of what happened in Saqifa and there is a Shia narrative of what happened in Saqifa. But the strength in the argument of the Shias, and we don't say this because we are Shia, is that the Shia argument is also drawing from sources that would be considered to be Sunni. These are not arguments, the narrative of the Shia is also coming from the same sources, but there are some reports that are being looked at by one group and not the other, and vice versa. In a lot of the Sunni narrative, and this is because the early scholars, in an attempt to keep the community as one and to show that there was no strife amongst the Sahaba of the Prophet, it is very sanitized, for lack of a better term, where it is portrayed that there wasn't so much conflict. And so the narrative is that when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, Umar ibn al-Khattab could not believe that the Prophet had passed away. He was very upset, and Abu Bakr showed up and he calmed him down and he went inside and he saw the Prophet had passed away and he kissed him and he said, "You are dearer to me than my mother and my father." And he went out, he calmed Umar. And this is now a narrative that I have taken from a very popular book called Muhammad by Martin Lings. And this book was a bestseller. It is written in a very narrative style. And very strangely, to us at least, he says Ali just withdrew to his house with Talha and Zubair. So when the Prophet passed away, Ali just went and withdrew to his house. And all the Muhajirun now gathered around Abu Bakr. And they found out that the Ansar were at a place called Saqifa Banu Sa'ida. The Ansar were two major tribes, Aus and Khazraj. And so very nicely the Muhajirun followed Abu Bakr and they went to this Saqifa, and the Ansar began speaking and presenting their case. And Umar wanted to speak, but Abu Bakr gestured to him and told him, don't say anything yet. And then he stood up and spoke. And he said to the Ansar that, look, the Prophet was from the Quraysh and people will not accept anyone except one who is from Quraysh. The Ansar began saying, then why don't we choose one leader from us and one leader from you? To which Abu Bakr then said that you cannot have two swords in one sheath. This is not going to work. And then he took the hands. Now there were two dominant individuals who had gone to Saqifa with Abu Bakr. One was Umar and one was a man called Abu Ubaidah. Many of you have not heard of Abu Ubaidah, but if you read the history and what happened at Saqifa, he played a very dominant role. The scholar Wilfred Medlung, to whom I will refer to very frequently tonight, in his very, well-known book, Succession to Muhammad, he says that after Umar passed away, the third caliph would have been Abu Ubaidah. But Abu Ubaidah passed away before Umar did. So, and he says they were very close. So, Abu Bakr then took the hands of Abu Ubaidah and Umar. And he said to the Ansar, I give you a choice between these two individuals, Umar and Abu Ubaidah. Select one of them as your caliph. Then Umar objected and said, don't you know that the Prophet ordered Abu Bakr to offer prayers in his illness? And they said, yes. Then he said, then who amongst you would dare to take precedence over him? Then he took hold of the hand of Abu Bakr and said, I pledge allegiance to him. And Abu Ubaidah did the same. And then the Muhajirun one by one began doing bay'ah. And then the Ansar did that one by one. And then the next day, Abu Bakr led the Fajr prayers and he sat on the Prophet's pulpit. And then Umar rose and said, the best of you, the companion of the Prophet, Thani Athnain, the second of the two in the cave, pledge allegiance to him. And everybody pledged allegiance as a group. Ali bin Abi Talib did not, because he didn't happen to be at the mosque, he was at home, but then he pledged allegiance later on. And thereafter, the Prophet's family washed and shrouded the Prophet, and the companions came in groups one by one, and they prayed for the Prophet, and they buried him. And Medina felt very sad, and they rebuked each other for crying, because it was bid'ah to cry for someone who passed away. But they also were weeping amongst themselves, even as they told each other not to weep. And some of them said, we're not weeping because he has died, but we're weeping because revelation has been cut off from us. Now this is the kind of narrative you get in a book like the one I mentioned by Martin Lings. The Shia say that this is, as I said, a sanitized version and an attempt to show that it was very peaceful and there were no issues. Now if you read the book by Medlung, Succession to Muhammad, he pulls out from multiple sources, from Sirah ibn Ishaq, Sirah ibn Hisham, Tarikh Tabari, Tabaqat ibn Sa'ad, and multiple sources. And he shows a very, very different picture. First of all, there was a fight going on. There was a lot of arguments. There was absolutely no respect for one individual over the other. In the Ansar, the tribe of Khazraj, they were led by a man called Sa'ad bin Ubadah, and the Khazraj were trying to have him elected. Abu Bakr and Umar rushed in. The Ansar heard this argument from Abu Bakr that people will not accept anyone except the Quraysh, and they said, then if we have to elect a Muhajir, then we choose Ali, which was very interesting because he was not even there. Now, Zubair bin al-Awam was present. He pulled out a sword and there was a commotion. Umar grabbed the sword of Zubair. He struck it on a stone and he broke it. He called Zubair a dog. Now these are fully referenced with footnotes. You can go look it up. Then he pounced on Sa'ad bin Ubadah and he broke his ribs, and it was from these injuries that Sa'ad passed away. And then he grabbed hold of the hand of Abu Bakr and said, I pledge allegiance to him. And the person next to him did that. And suddenly there was a scramble and everybody was paying allegiance. And then the Aus began paying allegiance. And the Khazraj now thought, if we don't, we'll get left behind. So they started doing it. And there was a lot of commotion. Now, which version do we believe? Because it ends up being he said, she said, and there are two narratives. Medlung says the proof of this argument is that all Muslims agree that when Umar became the caliph, he was asked about what happened in Saqifa. At that point, both Abu Ubaidah and Abu Bakr had passed away. Now, these are the words of the Caliph Umar. He said, Wallahi inna amra bay'ata Abi Bakrin kanat faltatin. I swear by Allah, that affair of pledging allegiance to Abu Bakr was a mistake. He used the word falta, which is well known by all historians, that he called it a falta. فَوَقَ اللَّهُ أُمَّةً مِنْ شَرِّهَا. Allah protected the ummah from the evil of what happened that day. And then he said, if anyone attempts to do a similar thing of what happened on Saqifa, I will have him beheaded. So this is accepted by Muslims, that at the very least he described it as a falta. Now, what we say as Shias here is that the Prophet ﷺ did not appoint Abu Bakr as a caliph. But the argument that is being held by our Sunni brothers and sisters is that the reason Abu Bakr was deserving of the Khilafah is that he led the prayers on the last days when the Prophet was ill. But here there's a couple of challenges. First of all, there is a lot of contradictory reports about this leading of prayers. Even from the Sihah. There are reports to say that Aisha said, tell Abu Bakr, and Hafsa said, tell Umar. There are reports to say that Abu Bakr went to lead prayers, but when the Prophet found out, he immediately stood up even in all his illness, and he dragged himself to the mosque and asked him to step aside. There are reports to say that the Prophet went to the mosque, but he indicated to Abu Bakr to continue leading the prayers, but he just sat beside him, to which people then ask that if the Prophet had already indicated that Abu Bakr should lead the prayer, then why did he go to the mosque and just sit beside him, and so on and so forth. But if the reason to say that this is what would make him qualified to, or to indicate the hint that this is the one the Prophet wanted to be the leader, then there are other things that we could take that would give us even more indication of who was more deserving. For example, in those days that the Prophet ﷺ was ill, he appointed a young man called Usama bin Zayd bin Harith to lead and be the commander of his army. And he posted him outside Medina, and he asked all the Muslims to join the Jaysh of Usama. Now you as a Muslim, if you are reading two history narratives, and you know of one person that the Prophet most definitely appointed as a commander of the Muslim army and asked all the Muslims to join, and another narrative where there are multiple contradictory narratives of Abu Bakr going to lead prayers in the mosque, who in your opinion would you think is the Prophet most likely to have hinted to be the leader of the Muslims after? Furthermore, Muslims have other reports. They have reports, for example, that the Prophet ﷺ said, had there been a Prophet after me, it would have been Umar. Which then makes it very surprising that the Muslims did not remember this hadith when they were debating and arguing at Saqifa. There are many other such incidents that we can draw from. Let me give you another example. When Surah At-Tawbah was revealed, chapter 9 of the Quran, the Prophet ﷺ was asked that this surah has to be taken to Mecca and it has to be read out as a bara'ah to the people of Mecca, to the polytheists and Quraysh, to be told that God disavows himself from you. It was a declaration of war, in a sense, to them. The Prophet ﷺ gave Surah Tawbah to Abu Bakr and told him, go to Mecca and stand before the pilgrims and the people who come to Mecca on the season of Hajj and declare this bara'ah to them of Surah Tawbah. And Abu Bakr took off. It was a great honor. Before he got to Mecca, Imam Ali was sent behind him. He caught up with him. And he said to him, the Prophet ﷺ has asked me to take Surah At-Tawbah from you and that I should go and declare the bara'ah. And the Prophet ﷺ has said, if you wish, you can come with me, or if you wish, you can go back to Medina. Now all Muslims agree that Abu Bakr decided he's going to go back to Medina. So he goes back to Medina, and he goes to the Prophet ﷺ, and he says to him, Ya Rasulullah, if you didn't want me to do it, then why give it to me in the first place? Why this humiliation? To which the Prophet ﷺ told him that I gave it to you, but Jibreel came to me after and said, "O Muhammad, your Lord says this can only be done by yourself or someone who is like you. And he told me that I have no choice. The only person who can do this is either you go yourself, O Muhammad, or you send Ali bin Abi Talib." So Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad bulantar salawat. From this, what we could argue, our case in defense of Ali bin Abi Talib, is to say that, look, even if the Prophet himself wanted to give Abu Bakr a representation to be in his place, Allah intervenes. You see, so there are so many ways in which you can argue, and what I'm trying to say is that the mere fact that Abu Bakr led the prayers when the Prophet was ill, amongst many narrations that don't all say the same thing consistently, cannot be the ironclad evidence to say he and only he was deserving of the caliphate and he was the one the Prophet intended. The other argument that is given is that Abu Bakr was not just a Sahaba, but he was the oldest of them in age, and therefore he was the most eminent. So the argument that is presented is that, look, Ali bin Abi Talib was very knowledgeable, but he was not mature. He was a young man in his 30s. He didn't have that sense of elderliness in the community to have commanded that respect to take on the leadership of the Ummah. Now, is age a factor? And there is a very interesting report, and I hesitate to say it because when I say it, it comes across as if we are trying to mock the Caliph Abu Bakr. But I say to you, my Sunni brothers and sisters, if you're listening to me online or in the audience, I say this without any sense of sarcasm, but this is in our books, that when Abu Bakr was elected, his father found out, Abu Quhafa, and people said to Abu Quhafa, congratulations, your son has become the Caliph of the Muslims. And he said, on what merits did my son deserve to be the Caliph of the Muslims? They said, oh, Abu Quhafa, he was chosen because of his age being the eldest. To which Abu Quhafa said, in that case, why did you not elect me? Because I am older than him. Now this is in our books, which means that you can see that even the father of Abu Bakr is not convinced with such an argument. Does the Quran have a criteria of who deserves to lead Muslims? Yes, it does. The children of Israel at one point were being persecuted, and they were under the leadership of a prophet who was called Ishmael, or in the Bible, Samuel, I believe. And they came to the prophet and said, ask Allah to appoint for us a king who will lead us in war against our enemies. So the first thing we learn is that in the Sunnah of Allah, as handed down to the children of prophets and all, is they knew that if you need a leader, it is only God who appoints. You do not choose one amongst yourselves. So the Prophet says to them, perhaps you might not fight, you might not accept it. They said, no, why would we not go and fight when our women are oppressed and our children are oppressed and our old are oppressed and so on. So he prays to Allah, and Allah says, tell them, your leader and king will be Talut. Now Talut was a very poor man, he was a shepherd. And when they heard that Allah has made Talut their leader and their king to go and fight against Jalut. Jalut is the biblical Goliath. They protested this, and this is in the Quran, to say, on what merit does Talut deserve to be our leader when he is neither a rich man, nor does he have a social standing, nor is he one of our elders and leaders. He is just a poor man, a shepherd. Now the Quran says that Allah said to the Prophet, that tell them Allah has chosen Talut because he has made him bastatan fil ilmi wal jism. He has endowed him with immense knowledge and physical strength. So you now begin to see that Allah has a certain yardstick. He has a certain mi'yar. And the Quran says, وَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ tabdila. You will not find a change in God's practice and God's sunnah. His mi'yar says the same. So now if Muslims say the Prophet did not elect someone, if you really want to know who was the most qualified, look for the amongst the ummah who was bastatan fil ilmi wal jism.
Muhammad wa ali Muhammad bulantar salawat.
Allah.
bar Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Shia and Sunni have this hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said, "A'lamukum Ali ibn Abi Talib." The most knowledgeable amongst you is Ali ibn Abi Talib. Ana madinatul ilm wa aliyun babuha. And all Muslims acknowledge there was no one superior in knowledge to him. Knowledge of Quran, tafsir, everything the ummah has is from Ali. One of the greatest mufassir of Islam is Abdullah bin Abbas. Abdullah bin Abbas was a student of Ali bin Abi Talib. Whether it's Arabic grammar introduced by Ali, whether it is spirituality, all the Sufi tariqas, they go back to Ali. So Quran you look, Hadith you look, he is the only individual who dared to sit on a pulpit and say, Saluni, Saluni, qablan tafqiduni. Ask me whatever you want before you lose me. Right? So, he is the most knowledgeable. Then when it comes to courage and prowess and strength and physical strength, look at the history of Islam and give us the name of anyone who had more shuja'ah than Ali bin Abi Talib. So, it becomes very clear. Now, in the interest of time, we move again. Let's make a few comments about Ghadir. Ghadir is an incident that the Shias, by the way, say that the very first meeting the Prophet had, Da'wat Dhul Ashira, he declared Ali his caliph. And the very last meeting he had, Ghadir, he declared Ali bin Abi Talib. Now, Ghadir is one incident where no Muslim can deny it. It is mutawatir. There are so many reports on Ghadir that the Prophet said, Man kuntu mawlahu fa'adha aliyun mawla. Through so many chain of narrators and transmitters that it is absolutely impossible to cast a doubt on it. And that is why the argument always comes down to the word of Mawla. What does Mawla mean? But the Muhaddithun will tell you, you have to be insane or an absolute liar to suggest that Ghadir never happened. It absolutely cannot be denied. Books have been written in volumes with all the chain of transmitters. Now, I just want to ask a few simple questions as food for thought. There is all this discussion, what does Mawla mean? Mawla means friend, Mawla means that. The Prophet sent Ali to Yemen before Hajj, and the people of Yemen were not happy with the way he distributed wealth, and therefore the Prophet had to declare that don't be upset with Ali, and whoever is the friend of me is the friend of Ali, and all that. Okay, simple questions. Muslims say that when the Prophet, the reason he stopped at Ghadir is because chapter 5 verse 67 was revealed, in which the Prophet was told, Balligh ma unzila ilayk, that deliver, O Prophet, what has been given to you. Now that verse is very interesting. It says, if you do not deliver what we ask you to deliver, فَمَا بَلَّغْتَ رِسَالَةً, then it is as if you have not conveyed any of his message. So our question is, what was it that was so important that Allah had to use such a stern language to his Prophet, and he has never used such language anywhere else in the Quran? Was it to tell the Muslims to pray? That was done. To fast? That was done. What was it? And then the verse goes on and says, Wallahu ya'asimuka minan nas. And don't fear, Allah will protect you from the people. What was that message that was so important, yet potentially so contentious, that Allah has to guarantee his Prophet protection from people, keeping in mind those people are his followers, they are his ummah. And Allah is saying he will protect you from people. Now, not only that, when he has delivered the message, then Allah says, Al-yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum. This day I have completed for you your religion. Akmaltu lakum dinukum wa atmamtum alaykum ni'mati. And I have completed on you all my favors. Wa raditu lakumul Islam dina. And now I am pleased with you for Islam as your deen. So what was it that was said at Ghadir that hadn't been said before? And when it was said, then religion was complete and perfected. Because at Ghadir, the Prophet ﷺ first took a declaration from the Muslims and said, have I delivered to you the message of God? And they said, Bala ya Rasulullah. Have I told you to pray and fast? They said, Bala ya Rasulullah. He told them everything, asked them about everything, and they confessed, you have told us everything. He said, then now I tell you, that he said to them, Alastu awla bikum min anfusikum. Do I not have more right on you than you have over yourselves? They said, Bala ya Rasulullah. Then he said, Man kuntu mawlahu fahada aliyun mawla. Now, why was this such a sensitive issue, and why such stern language, and then why such, confirmation that religion has been completed? If we take the meaning, that the meaning was that Ali is the friend of people, then does it mean that religion was incomplete until everyone became friends with Ali? So, we don't need to argue on the meaning of Mawla. We need to look at these verses and say, what was delivered on that day that made it so urgent, so stern, needed protection from people, and then completed religion? And not only that, but the fact that Muslims after came and congratulated Ali bin Abi Talib. The Caliph Umar himself, for example, is on record to have said to Ali bin Abi Talib, Bakhin, Bakhin, laka yabna Abi Talib. Congratulations, O son of Abu Talib. Asbahta mawla'i wa mawla kullu mu'minin. You have this day become my mawla and the mawla of every believer. So again, what would that mean, if whatever meaning we give to mawla? Now very quickly, let's ask a few more questions. Now let's take the premise that the Prophet ﷺ never appointed a successor. And I've mentioned some of these points, but I will mention them very quickly. We ask this question, why would the Prophet not have appointed a successor? Number one, why is it that the Prophet never thought that this would cause an issue in the Ummah, but the Muslims realized immediately that this will cause an issue even before he was washed and buried? Number two, the Prophet ﷺ was ill for 4 days and everyone knew he was dying. Why did no one ask him? Number three, the Prophet ﷺ announced several months before at Ghadir that he is leaving, and in Medina that Jibreel came to me and recited the Quran twice to me and therefore I'm leaving you. Why did no one ask him, whom should we follow? Number four, why did the Prophet ﷺ also not say that I am not appointing anyone for reason X or reason Y, or that Allah has said to me don't appoint anyone? Number five, whatever reason Allah and His Messenger had for not appointing, if we look at the condition of the Ummah then and now, do you think that their vision was a good one and that it bore fruit and turned out exactly as Allah and His Messenger had expected? Out of the 4 Khulafa that the Muslims call Khulafa ur-Rashidun, 3 of them were murdered. The 2nd Caliph, the 3rd Caliph, and the 4th Caliph. And as a result of that, the Khawarij came to be. And the Khawarij were as brutal as, for example, ISIS today. The Khawarij would, for example, stab a pregnant woman in the stomach with a spear, right? We have such incidents. It was the same idea of beheading and abuse, comparable. People have compared these two groups. So, Allah and His Messenger bring the final religion, the best religion, the final revelation, the final prophet, and then don't appoint anyone. They must have had some vision of how this ummah will continue. When we look at the history of Islam, even in the early days when all these early caliphs were being murdered, and how different groups rose, and divisions and fights, to the state of Muslims today, would you say that their vision is continuing to grow in the right direction and in bearing the fruit that was expected by them? Now, Muslims have reasons that they offer to say why the Prophet did not appoint. But when I give you these reasons, I want you to keep in mind, it's not based on any proof from the Prophet. It's just guessing. They're guessing that this may be why the Prophet did not appoint a successor. And I'm going to take only 2 reasons. One was the fact that the Prophet ﷺ did not want to establish a tribal system of hereditary inheritance. Whoever the Prophet would appoint, then after him his son would come, and his son would come, and it would be a tribal thing, or his brother would come. The second reason is that Islam was a religion, not a political or a governing system. So the Prophet just came to deliver a message. He came, he delivered a message, he gave us the Quran, and then he went away. Now governing, ruling was left to the Muslims to decide how they will govern themselves while following the teachings of Islam. Now on the first argument, that the Prophet did not appoint a successor because he did not want to establish a tribal system, we ask the following questions. First of all, did that plan of the Prophet succeed? It didn't, because the Umayyads came to power very shortly after Imam Ali. And then the Abbasids came, and then the Ottomans came. And to this day we have monarchies in the Middle East and different families ruling. So that plan that I am not going to appoint a successor because it will lead to tribalism utterly failed, because that's exactly what happened. Number two, Abu Bakr at Saqifa argued with the Ansar that you cannot be the leaders because the Prophet was from Quraysh and therefore people will not accept anyone except one who is from Quraysh. This is a tribalistic argument, is it not? And when Imam Ali was told that Abu Bakr was elected in Nahjul Balagha, he said, on what basis did the Muhajirun argue against the Ansar? He was told they argued on the basis that they have a greater right because they are from the Quraysh and the Prophet is from the Quraysh. To which Imam Ali said, they fought for the tree but they spoiled the fruits. Meaning you fought for Quraysh on the basis that you are Quraysh, therefore you have a greater right, but you didn't come further down, line the tree and say the Prophet is also Banu Hashim. Therefore, if that is the argument, then the leader should have been from the Banu Hashim. Now, the third thing is, the Prophet ﷺ could also stop tribalism by electing someone who was not from Quraysh, if he really wanted to stop tribalism. But he didn't do that either. Fourthly, if the Prophet would have elected someone from his family and from a tribe, like Quraysh, why do we conclude that the Sahaba would have rejected it? Were they not the most obedient and the best of this ummah? And would they not have concluded that if the Prophet elected someone from a particular tribe, even if it's own family, then this is a command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they must submit to it? So this argument that Allah did not want or the Prophet was afraid it will cause tribalism does not hold water. As for the second argument, that Islam is only a religion and it wasn't meant to be a governing system and political system, I will talk about this in more detail inshallah 2 nights from now. But we just ask again here to say that if governing is not tied to religion, then why do Muslims constantly try to establish Islamic states? That would be a bid'ah. And secondly, why then do we say that one who dies without an imam dies the death of jahala? Man mata bi ghayri imamin mata mitatal jahiliyyah. Because once the Prophet delivered the message, now the Prophet doesn't intend for Islam to be a government. Anyone can rule and respect the values of Islam, but there shouldn't be a need that you must pay bay'ah and allegiance to someone. So again, that does not hold water, and we shall talk about this in more argument. Another thing for Muslims to consider is that when you look at the life of Imam Ali alayhi salam, you see from the time he was a youth and a child, he was very active in Islam. He was at the forefront and he was the closest to the Prophet throughout his life. As soon as the Prophet ﷺ passed away, he disappeared from Muslim history for 25 years. Our question is that if he had pledged bay'ah to the early caliphs, why is he not to be seen playing an active role in the promotion and spread of Islam? During the time of the early caliphs, the Muslims took Syria, they took Egypt, they went out to different regions, Persia, so on. Why is Imam Ali not there at the forefront doing jihad, spreading Islam, supporting the caliphs? Why has he vanished until he becomes the caliph? Now, I want to end this discussion by saying there is an irony to this whole discussion. And that irony is that those who say that Allah did appoint a successor, i.e. the Shi'as, they mention only one name, Ali bin Abi Talib. There is no Muslim sect that says the Prophet appointed a successor and they name anyone else other than Ali bin Abi Talib. Anyone who says the Prophet did appoint a successor, he only mentions or she only mentions Ali bin Abi Talib. So if we go on the basis that the Prophet did appoint someone, the only name that is given to us is Ali bin Abi Talib. And those who say that the Prophet wanted the Muslims collectively to decide who should be their leader, when we look at the history of all the Khulafa, there is only one individual that was collectively selected by the Ummah, and that was Ali bin Abi Talib. Abu Bakr was elected by a small group in a closed door meeting. Umar was elected by Abu Bakr on his deathbed. Uthman was elected through a shura. Ali bin Abi Talib was not elected by one or two or a group. The whole Ummah thronged him and insisted, and for 3 days he kept them on hold, and they did not leave his door until he accepted to be the caliph. After him, no one was elected like this. Not Muawiyah, not Yazid, not anyone else. Which therefore means that if the Prophet wanted to elect someone and he did appoint someone, that was Ali bin Abi Talib. And if the Prophet wanted the Ummah collectively to get together and appoint someone, then the only person the Ummah ever elected was Ali bin Abi Talib. So whether you believe the Prophet elected someone or didn't elect someone, your only candidate is Ali bin Abi Talib. Food for thought. Now, we come to the history of the Khulafa, which was what I really wanted to discuss tonight. And what I want to do here is not essentially make a laundry list of all the things the Shia object to with regards to the early caliphs and basically say this is why we distance ourselves from these caliphs and this is wrong and this is wrong and this is wrong. In fact, where I can, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt and say perhaps this is what they were trying to do. But the reason for narrating this is to say that when the Ummah left the door of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam and they decided choosing whoever they thought was the most fitting, sincerely or for any other reason, because these were fallible beings, the decisions they made not only caused harm to the Ummah at the time, but there were downstream effects of that which Muslims now pay the price for even today. Tomorrow I will discuss the history of Muslims at a much later phase, not in the early Khilafah. And then day after, inshallah, on the night of Ashura, I will talk about the challenges that Muslims face today, Shia and Sunni. And again, you will see that some of this is left over through decisions made by those who led Muslims in the early stages. What I have done is, I have picked and categorized 3 major issues that the Shias highlight with each one of the 3 caliphs. I don't need to discuss issues related to the Umayyads and Abbasids because the crimes and the tyranny of the Banu Abbas and Banu Umayyah is there before all the Muslim Ummah. The point where Muslims have a lot of polemic arguments and where there is a lot of sensitivity and where unfortunately we don't have respectful discussions is around the issue of the Khulafa al-Rashidun, the first 3 caliphs that the Muslims call Khulafa al-Rashidun. And this is where it is very sensitive and the discussions is walking on eggshells to be careful not to offend anyone, or it is done in a reckless manner that causes more harm than good. So I want to be respectful, but I want to highlight the issues. So I've picked 3 major aspects. With regards to the Khilafah of the first Caliph, Abu Bakr, I have already mentioned actually these 3 things, but I just want to mention a few points on them. The first issue that Shias found to be problematic is the fact that the Prophet ﷺ had fortified and built strength with the Ansar and the Muhajirun in Mecca. And what Abu Bakr did was, as soon as he took power, he brought back the leaders of the Quraysh in Mecca who had just converted to Islam 2 or 3 years before and in many cases just surrendered really. And he brought them back and gave them positions of power and authority. This completely marginalized the Ansar and took them away from the political scene and shattered that sense of ukhuwa and brotherhood and sincerity and God-fearingness that had existed in Medina. Now, we need to ask ourselves, why would he have done that? Because he was in Medina. He was not with the Quraysh who had surrendered and so on and so forth. Wilfred Medlung, and if there's one book you should read through this whole discussion that I'm having on Orthodox Islam, it is this book you should consider reading. Wilfred Medlung's Succession to Muhammad. It's printed by Cambridge University Press. It is a heavy reading, 400 pages plus, small print. If you like that sort of reading academic, it's definitely worth your time. He says that in Saqifa, the Ansar and Abu Bakr had disagreed on who should be the leader. So the Ansar were not supportive of Abu Bakr even though they gave him bay'ah. The Banu Hashim as well were opposed to him. Now without support from the Banu Hashim and the Ansar and some of the prominent Muhajirun who are close to Ali bin Abi Talib, Abu Bakr did not have the support to carry out whatever he wanted to do with the government that he was putting in place. And therefore, he now needed to reach out to those who had some social standing and some political experience that could help him undertake whatever he sought to undertake. And therefore, he brought in the Banu Makhzum and Banu Abdul Shams from the Quraysh. These were the two most powerful tribes. It is from this Banu Makhzum and Banu Abdul Shams that he brought in people and made them commanders of his army. People like Khalid bin Walid, people like Ikrimah bin Abu Jahl, people like Yazid bin Abu Sufyan, people like Sa'id ibn al-As, and they became initially the commanders of his army when he went after the tribes in the outskirts who were not paying their zakat. You remember I mentioned the Ridda wars, Hurub Ridda. And after those were over, he then made them commanders who went out to on expeditions to conquer Syria, Egypt, and other lands. And obviously, once they took on these positions, their role continued to grow within the Muslim community, and that of the original Ansar began to shrink. I want to mention some very quick examples of the crimes of some of these individuals, like Khalid bin Walid. Khalid bin Walid was sent by Abu Bakr to go and fight some of these tribes who were not paying zakat. And amongst them was a tribe that was led by a very eminent noble man that was called Malik bin Nuwaira. Malik bin Nuwaira was very well respected, but he had opposed initially Abu Bakr, and then he surrendered and agreed and said he would pay zakat. Now, when Khalid bin Walid came to this place where Malik bin Nuwaira was with his tribe, they had an argument, and we are told Malik bin Nuwaira's wife went and pleaded with Khalid bin Walid to spare her husband. It so happened that Malik's wife was considered to be one of the most beautiful women of Arabia, and there are different names for her, one of which is Layla, and there are other names. Her fame and repute of her beauty and her grace was well known in Arabia, that there were very few women who were as beautiful as the wife of Malik bin Nuwaira. And some reports say that when she went to plead to Khalid bin Walid, her face was uncovered and her hair was disheveled, and he saw her. The moment Khalid bin Walid saw her, Malik bin Nuwaira said, "Alas, now I shall die, and I shall be killed because of the beauty of this woman." And Khalid bin Walid said, "You are a kafir, you must be killed." Malik bin Nuwaira said, "I am a Muslim." He read the Shahada. But Khalid bin Walid had him beheaded. And once he was beheaded, he said, "Now I shall marry her," and he married her the same night. Muslims were very upset by this, because by Islamic law, a woman has to observe the period of iddah before she can be married. Furthermore, this was a forceful marriage, so indeed it wasn't even a sin that was consensual, it was actually an abuse of a Muslim woman. The Muslims were extremely upset by this. Some of them even left Khalid bin Walid. When this army came back, we are told that Umar was furious about this, and he asked Abu Bakr to have Khalid bin Walid put to death. But Abu Bakr left Khalid bin Walid. And he said that even Wahshi, when he tore the stomach of Hamza at Uhud, so that his liver may be chewed, the Prophet forgave Wahshi. And therefore I forgive Khalid bin Walid. Now, the reason for that we don't know. Perhaps because, now, if a Shia was to guess this, he would say that Khalid bin Walid was a commander who would have been useful in other conquests. But whatever the reason may be, this is very early in the days of Islam, when Muslims are witnessing a system that in their opinion is not just. So there were many incidents like this. If you have the time, go look up another incident regarding a man who was called Fujat Salmi. Fujat Salmi was a man who disobeyed Abu Bakr. He plundered some wealth, and when he was caught and brought to Abu Bakr had him burnt alive to death. And we're told that when he was dying, the things that Abu Bakr, he mentioned 3 things that he regretted doing. And amongst the things that he regretted doing was having burnt Fujat Salmi alive. So there are many such incidents that took place. So the first thing that we show concern about is the fact that the first Khilafat brought these Quraysh back into the Ummah and gave them roles when they were not worthy of these roles. The second issue was the fact that the household of the Prophet's importance was downplayed. And I mentioned the incident of Fadak last night. And the third incident was the change in policy of how the Prophet ﷺ functioned, such as the collection of zakat, where the Prophet did not force and go to war to collect taxes from the Ummah. And even the Caliph Umar was surprised at the approach that Abu Bakr took to say, we will go to war, but we will collect the taxes. This started a precedence where the Caliph can change the policy of the Prophet ﷺ in how the government functions and how it is run. Now very quickly, we go to the Khilafat of the Caliph Umar. With the Khilafat of the second Caliph, there were 3 issues that we point out. The first issue that we show as concerns as Shias is that it is very clear from the books of history that the Caliph Umar discriminated between Arabs and non-Arabs. And he was concerned that there should not be a dynastic rule. He did not want to establish a tribalist rule, but he also did not want to promote the non-Arabs. And that put him in a bind, because then the Arabs were the Quraysh. Madelung says that by the time Muawiyah and Amr ibn al-As came to power, they essentially put a definite end to the early companions ruling and the non-Arabs. Omar did not only restrict non-Muslims from entering Medina, he had a policy where Muslims who were not Arabs were also restricted from entering Medina. Now this I'm saying with references to history, and I can't provide all the references now, but you can look them up or ask for them after. When Omar was struck, he was struck by a Persian called Abu Lu'lu. And we are told in the books of history that he accused Ibn Abbas and his father, and he told them, it is because of your eagerness to multiply the Muslims with non-Arabs that this has happened. I was struck by Abu Lu'lu, and he was accusing them that you have encouraged all these non-Arabs to become Muslims, and now look at what has happened. Abdullah ibn Abbas said to him, I will do with them whatever you command. To which he said, it is now too late. How can you now do anything with them when these non-Arabs have now learned to speak the Arabic language and the language of their masters, and they now pray salat with the Arabs, and they share in the acts of devotion with the Arabs. And before he died, he ordered that any Arab who was a slave of the state, they should be freed. Now, some historians say that in fact it was this policy of being against the non-Arabs that infuriated Abu Lu'lu, which is why he attacked Omar. And in retaliation, the son of Omar, one of the sons of Omar, who was called Ubaidullah, is reported to have said that he would have killed any non-Arab that he could find in retaliation for his father's death. Now, I quote a passage here from Madelung. Madelung says, yet it was in reality the Khilafat of the Quraysh conceived and founded by Abu Bakr that in spite of its lack of Quran legitimization, that now became the essential institution of Islam upheld by the Sunni creed. These are his words. He is arguing that the Khilafat that Muslims had was the Khilafat of the Quraysh, that before the Khilafat of the Banu Umayyah, there was a Khilafat of the Quraysh. And this was institutionalized and conceived by Abu Bakr, even though it had no legitimacy on the argument of the Quran. Then he says, Umar's attempt to Islamicize this institution by trying to base it on Quranic principles like the principles of Shura and Sabiqa was doomed to failure almost immediately after his death. Not much later, a dynastic succession came to prevail, and this was a development that Umar had dreaded. The reason for the failure of Umar's reform is easily discernible. The principle of merit in Islam was in latent conflict with the privileged status of Quraysh. What he's saying is that Umar did not want a dynastic rule. He tried to Islamicize this Khilafat of Quraysh by saying, we will hold a shura and we will give importance to those who became Muslims first and so on. But he says this was doomed to failure. Why? Because the very fact that the Quraysh were given a privileged status, that was completely in opposition to the principle of who gets merit in Islam. And then he finally says, in order to institutionalize the principles of merit and shura, Umar would have had to repeal the supreme status of the Quraysh. And this was an attempt that he was hardly in a position to take, even if he had contemplated it. The domination of the Arabs over the non-Arabs on an ethnic basis was also in essential conflict with the universal call of Islam. What he's saying is that Umar could not have Islamicized this institution because he had put in also a policy where the Arabs were more important than the non-Arabs. And that in itself was against the universality of Islam. So he could not have then Islamicized it. And if you look at the history of Muslims now, if we talk of downstream effect, you will see that discrimination in Muslim Ummah of Arabs against non-Arabs continues to this day. You go to the Middle East, anywhere, go to Saudi Arabia, go to Kuwait, go to UAE, go to anywhere, go to Qatar, go wherever you want. Some of you have lived there. You can clearly see that there is this discrimination, even if you are a Sunni Muslim. If you are a Sunni Muslim who is a Pakistani or an Indian or anyone who is non-Arab, you are discriminated against not on the basis of your faith or your wealth, but on the fact that you are not Arab. It is very clear. So, even when they establish a kingdom, they don't just say, Mamlakatu Saudiya. No, it is Mamlakatu Arabiyatu Saudiya. So that idea of Arab, and if time had permitted, then tomorrow night when we talk about this, we would talk about how Muslims in the later days after the First and Second World War, they first started to think we need to revive Islam, and they started this Pan-Islamism movement. And when that failed, they tried to do what is Pan-Arabism. When they got together as countries and tried to fight Israel and lost that war, and for a long time they kept drumming this idea of Arabs are one, and that came first over being Muslims. It is only now that you're seeing cracks in that whole thing with Qatar and opposition to the other Arabs and so on. But this issue continued in Muslim Ummah and this mindset. And we see that when Ali bin Abi Talib became the caliph, this was one of the things that he opposed severely. Now I want to mention the two other points very quickly with regards to the Caliph Umar. The other thing that is concerning to the Shias is that one of the policies of the Caliph Umar was that he banned the recording of Hadith. And this proved to be a great disaster for Islam. Why? Because Muslims were not allowed to record Hadith, and whatever they recorded was burnt. And for several decades, they did not record Hadith. By the time they woke up to the need that we are losing what the Prophet said and did, and his Sunnah, a lot of the Sahaba were dying. And so now the information was not there. And that created a whole industry where people would take money to write Hadith. And then political parties and governments hired people and paid them to forge Hadith in their interest. The problem of hadith being forged and all this issue of sahih, not sahih, and checking and transmission and ilmul rijal and ilmul hadith, it became a huge issue because Muslims did not record the sayings and traditions of the Prophet in the early days. And we have to be fair and say that this was single-handedly banned by the second caliph. Now, a well-known Sunni scholar, Professor Muhammad Zubair Siddiqui, who was a professor in Calcutta University, he has a very nice book called Hadith Literature. And in this book, he gives evidence in hadith to say that when the Caliph Umar was not sure, should I allow hadith recording or not, he pondered on it for 1 month before deciding he is not going to allow hadith to be recorded. The Shias have their own story as to why he would not have allowed hadith to be spread, but we will not go into that. But what Professor Siddiqui says is, he says the fact that Umar had to think about it for a whole month is proof that he could not find any authentic hadith from the Prophet forbidding the recording of hadith. And at the end of that, he said, I am concerned that if Muslims start recording hadith and giving importance to it, they will neglect the Quran. And therefore he banned hadith. So again, we can't discuss it in detail, but this was the second issue. The third issue that the Shias have with the Caliph Umar is that the Caliph Umar made many changes to Sharia. And he modified or changed or even made haram things that the Prophet had made halal. And a very quick list here. One is that he introduced a prayer that is known as Taraweeh amongst Muslims, and he institutionalized it so that many Sunnis consider it to be Sunnah Mu'akkada. The Shias consider it to be a bid'ah that the Prophet never introduced. The Shias said there is nothing wrong with reciting Quran in your salat. You as an individual in the month of Ramadan, if you want to stand up in night in prayer in your salat, you want to hold the Quran and pray, that is fine. But to make it something that you pray in jama'ah, in the mosque, and institutionalize it, would have had to come from the Prophet. It cannot be institutionalized by a caliph. Other examples would be that the Caliph Umar banned 2 types of mut'ahs. He said the Prophet had allowed Hajj at-Tamattu and the marriage of mut'ah, and I now make this haram. And there's again a whole discussion to this. But this, in the Sunni well-known book Jami al-Usul, they quoted from Sahih Muslim that it was the Caliph Umar who banned it. Some Sunni Muslims said the Prophet had banned it. But most reports say the same. Fakhruddin Razi as well in his tafsir says it was the Caliph Umar who banned this. So once again we see an example where the Prophet allowed something, but the Caliph Umar believed that the Caliph has a right to change the laws of Sharia. There are many other examples that Muslims give. One example is that the Caliph Umar used to believe that you should not do tayammum. If you don't have water for wudu, then you should not pray until you find water. Now tayammum is given in the Quran in chapter 4 verse 43, and there are very clear ahadith in Sunni sources. In books like Musnad ibn Ahmad, Sunan Nasa'i, Sunan Ibn Majah, Sunan Abu Dawud, there is a very clear indication that Umar was traveling on one occasion and there was no water. Or not traveling, but there was no water. And Ammar Yasir, the companion of the Prophet, said to him, I heard from the Prophet that if you don't have water, you must do tayammum. To which Umar refused. And he said, shall I tell you what the Prophet told me? And the Caliph Umar said to him, Ittaqillah ya Ammar, fear God, O Ammar. To which Ammar Yasir said, in that case, I will not tell you the hadith of the Prophet. Now, there are some Sunni schools who still follow this. The Hanafi school, for example, follows this teaching of Umar, where tayammum is only done if you are traveling or you are ill and you don't have water. But if you are in your hometown and you don't have water, then you don't do tayammum. You simply don't pray until you find water. Okay, so this is again a change. Another change that Muslims record is the Prophet ﷺ had a practice where if someone passed away, then Salatul Mayyit would be done with 5 takbirs. The Caliph Umar changed it to 4 takbirs. Another example is the Prophet ﷺ, based on the Quran, had said that if a man divorces his wife, these 3 divorces have to be at separate times. If a man pronounces the divorce to his wife 3 times in that one sitting, that counts as only 1 divorce. But at the time of the Caliph Umar, because there was a lot of cases of divorce, to discourage people from divorcing their wives, he changed it and said, if you divorce your wife 3 times on one sitting, that is 3 divorces. It is done. So be careful before you say talaq, 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 because then it's gone. Right? So once again, we see a change in the Sharia. The Caliph Umar is also said to have allowed wiping on the socks in wudu instead of on your washing your feet. We wipe on our feet. Our Sunni brothers wash their feet. But if they're wearing socks, they can wipe on it. There are other such examples that are in books, and some our Sunni brothers may not agree with and say this is falsely being attributed to the Caliph. There is example that he fixed the mahar amount for women to say that men had to pay a fixed amount of mahar. And the Shias said that it was the Caliph Umar as well who removed Hayya ala khair al-amal from adhan. And it was the Caliph Umar who introduced in the Fajr prayers, as-salatu khairum minan nawm, and many other such examples. Now, you might deny some of this, you might disagree some of this, but you cannot deny all of them. So it becomes very clear that in the opinion of the Caliph Umar, it was permissible for him to change the Sharia. What the Shia say is that the evidence from the Quran suggests otherwise. In chapter 7, verse 157, Allah says, He talks about the Prophet and what the Prophet has come to do. And He says, وَيُحِلُّ لَكُمُ الطَّيِّبَاتِ وَيُحَرِّمُ عَلَيْكُمُ الْخَبَائِثِ. That one of the tasks and duties of this Prophet is that he makes halal for you what is good for you, and he makes haram for you what is bad for you. So only the Prophet is allowed to do this. In Surah Al-Hashr, chapter 59, verse 7, Allah says, وَمَا آتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ. Whatever the Prophet gives you, take it. وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُ. And whatever he holds you back from, keep away from it. Now this is Quran. These verses are not abrogated. How then does someone change the Sharia of Muhammad? Furthermore, Sharia actually does not even come from the Prophet. It comes from Allah. He is the Shari', the legislator. If you look at Surah Al-Baqarah and other surahs, you'll find in a lot of places when people would come and ask the Prophet religious questions, he would not reply. He would wait for revelation. For example, in one verse, in chapter 2, verse 189, Allah says to the Prophet, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْأَهِلَّةِ. They ask you about the moons and how you guide, for example, Ramadan, start and all that. And then the answer is given. In chapter 2, verse 217, he says, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الشَّهْرِ الْحَرَامِ قِتَالٌ فِيهِ. They ask you about fighting in the sacred months. In chapter 2, verse 219, he is told, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسِرِ. They ask you about gambling and consuming wine. So, in the fact that these verses says, يَسْأَلُونَكَ, 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 what is it suggesting? It is suggesting that when the Prophet was being asked, he was not telling them, this is my opinion. He was waiting until Allah tells him that, oh Muhammad, they are asking you about this, tell them this. So Sharia then comes only from Allah through His Prophet ﷺ and no one else. It is possible that the Caliph Umar thought that as the Ummah is evolving, the rules have to change. But could he have changed the Sharia? Now, I want to show you evidence that the Caliph Umar believed that the Sharia was not airtight and there was room to improve on it. When you look at the verses in the Quran that talk about riba, usury, all Sunni Mufassirun will quote a very popular hadith from the Caliph Umar, that the Caliph Umar said, the ayat of riba was revealed very much towards the end of the Prophet's life. And the Prophet did not have enough time to clarify the rules for us. Therefore, adopt on the basis of caution and leave what is doubtful for the sake of ihtiyat. These are the exact words, that the ayat of riba was revealed towards the end of the Prophet's life and he did not have time to clarify it for us. So now, because we're not sure what the rules are regarding interest and usury, keep away from it on the basis of ihtiyat. The Shia say, how is this possible when Allah has revealed, Al-yawma akmaltu lakum dinukum. This day I have completed your religion for you. Wa atmamtu alaykum ni'amati. And I have perfected, this day I have perfected for you your religion and I have completed for you my favors. وَرَضِيتُ لَكُمُ الْإِسْلَامَ دِينًا. How can Allah says, I have perfected your religion for you and completed it, if there are things the Prophet has not yet explained? So, these are some of the issues that the Shi'as raise. And I have run out of time, so I will not discuss the 3 points regarding the Caliph Uthman, but I will try and summarize them tomorrow night, inshallah. And a few points as well, just to mention on the Khilafat of Imam Ali as well, I will try and mention to say how he then disagreed with some of these changes and the attempts that he made to reverse what was there by his predecessors. And we see very clearly that at the Shura, that I will try and talk about tomorrow if time permits, that amongst the 6 people that the Caliph Umar had appointed in the Shura to decide who amongst them will be the Caliph, there came a point where the deciding factor was left to one of them, who was called Abdul Rahman bin Auf. And Abdul Rahman bin Auf first went to speak to Imam Ali before he went to speak to Uthman. And he said to Imam Ali, I am willing to say that you should be the Caliph if you agree that you will operate on the Quran, on the Seerah of the Prophet, and the Seerah of the Shaykhain. And Imam Ali alayhi salam is reported to have said, I will operate only on the Quran and the Seerah of the Prophet. If the Seerah of the Shaykhain is according to the Quran and the Seerah of the Prophet, then I will already be adopting it. And if it is in contradiction to the Quran and the Seerah of the Prophet, then I cannot adopt it. And Abdul Rahman bin Auf knew that Imam Ali will not lie. If he has said this, he will not do it. And it is on this reason then he opted to put forward the name of Uthman. So we will see some of the policies that Imam Ali tried to reverse, inshallah, very quickly tomorrow night. I want to conclude as well to say that our push here is not to disparage the Sahaba or to speak ill of them. And I know I've spoken more about the early caliphs here. But in particular, when we talk about the Umayyads and the Abbasids and others, our issue of concern here is that that definition of Sahaba being very broad and saying anyone who saw the Prophet, and also that simplistic approach to Islam where we say, if Abu Sufyan said, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, he's a Muslim. If Abu Talib, we do not have any record to say he said it, then he is a kafir. That needs to change. We need to be more discerning as Muslims to say, let us look at their history and their actions. Someone sent me a clip just before the 12 days of Muharram. It was a gathering, a lecture in a Sunni mosque, and some of you may have seen this. And there was a Sunni Imam who was speaking, and in his speech he was talking of history, and he started talking about Abu Talib. And he kept mentioning Abu Talib, and he kept saying Hazrat Abu Talib, Hazrat Abu Talib. And in his audience, there was an individual who had Wahhabi leanings. You may have seen this clip. And he started objecting to him. Don't say Hazrat for Abu Talib. To a point where they had to ask him to leave the mosque. And when he left, God bless this Sunni Imam. He was very passionate. He was almost in tears. He said to his audience, he said, if I knew this is the kind of people you have in your mosque, I would not even have accepted your invitation. He said, what have we become as an ummah, that if we say Hadrat for someone like Abu Talib, people are objecting. But for Yazid, we cannot even do his la'anat, and we have to say radiyallah for him. Is this what the ummah has become? And then he goes into a detail, and he praises the contributions of Abu Talib. That Abu Talib did not declare his shahada, but does that mean that he was not a Muslim? He recited the aqdun nikah of the Prophet. How can a kafir recite the marriage of your Prophet? So, to conclude this, one of my sisters sent me a few verses in Urdu that I think is very nice and worth bringing and highlighting this point. That we might say that we have traditions in our books that we can ignore, that vouch for injustices, or having the Prophet said, tolerate rulers who are unjust. But when a non-Muslim reads our books, what should we say to them? It leaves a very bad image of our Prophet in their eyes and of Muslims. And if we can change some of this and redefine things like who is Sahaba, what is Sahih, can we judge people by their actions and not just by their face value, then a larger number of people will find Islam to be appealing. Now, these words of poetry in Urdu are actually by a Hindu, and the Hindu's name is Mathur. Many of you may have heard these verses. He says, "Jam pe jam piya aur Musalman rahe." He's talking about drinking wine, and he's talking of the caliphs who came after. "Jam pe jam piya aur Musalman rahe. Qatl imamon ko kiya aur Musalman rahe. Yehi deen hai to is deen se toba Mathur." If this is your religion, yehi deen hai to is deen se toba Mathur. Shak payambar pe kiya aur Musalman rahe. Now Abu Talib. जिसने पाला पैगंबर को वो रहा काफिर, यजीदियों ने कत्ल हुसैन को किया और मुसलमान रहे. This sums up for us that this is how the world looks at us as Muslims. So when I talk about these issues, it is not to divide the ummah, it is not to cause pain to my Sunni brothers and sisters. It is merely to say that this is how the world sees us, and this is the Shia perspective, so that we may have a dialogue. And if we are mistaken, we welcome a similar discussion from a Sunni perspective, to say, look, from a Sunni perspective, this is how we see Islam, and this is how we explained those who led Islam, and this is why we believe this is the right approach, and this is Orthodox Islam. So the principles of Adala and Imama continue to come into play. But we must continue as Muslims to have this dialogue, as opposed to being resentful and saying, you know, this is nothing but a discussion to disparage those that are eminent and those that we look up to. But rather to reopen the books of history and once again look at it with discerning eyes and find where it is we lost the path. And we will find that the path that is clear before us is the path of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad alayhim afdalus salatu wassalam. Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad. Sallallahu wa sallam alayka ya Aba Abdullah. روحي وأرواح العالمين لك الفداء. يا ليتنا كنا معكم سيدي فنفوز فوزا عظيما. Tonight is the 8th night of Muharram, and I mention this every time I recite the majlis on the 8th night of Muharram, that of all the masa'ib I recite, this is the most difficult masa'ib to recite. And I say this with respect to Aba Abdullah al-Hussein, because for Hussein alayhi salam, you do not even need to recite masa'ib. You merely need to sit on the day of Ashura and think of Hussein, and you will weep. But just as it is impossible to recite the fada'il of Ali and do justice, it is impossible to recite the masa'ib of Abbas and do justice. For Abul Fadl al-Abbas is no ordinary man. He is beyond the understanding of humanity. He commands a presence that always holds people in awe. If you go to Karbala, you will see that all the shuhada are with Hussein and some are outside Karbala, but Abul Fadl al-Abbas has his own haram, and between the two is how Bainul Haramain comes to be. He is the commander of Hussein. He is to Hussein what Ali was to the Prophet. There are many names for Abbas alayhi salam. besides his kunya Abul Fadl, because he had a son called Fadl, and he was in Karbala with his brothers. He had 3 other brothers who were martyred before him. He is Hamilul Liwa, he is Saqqai Sakina, he is Ghazi to some, he is Alamdar to others, he is Nasir to some, he is Muasi to some. But one of his most radiant name is Qamar Banu Hashim, where you have the beauty of Aliun al-Akbar, where you have the radiance of Qasim. Amongst them, he is called the radiant moon of the Banu Hashim, Qamar Banu Hashim. And another title of his is Babul Hawa'ij. Babul Hawa'ij. He shares this title with Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam. He shares this title with a Ma'soom Imam. Why? I believe it is because that on the day of Ashura there was only one thing that Abbas wanted, and he did not get the one thing that he wanted. And in exchange for that, Allah rewarded him as if to say, "Oh Abbas, in exchange for that one pitcher of water that you wanted for Sakina, I will deny you that on the day of Ashura, but in exchange of that, I will make you a door for Hawa'ij of people. So that when you have no other door to turn to, then ask Allah with the wasila of Abbas alayhi salam." He is not an ordinary man. When we recite the Ziyarat Warith, and we come to the Ziyarah of Abbas, we describe him with the words, وَلَعْنَ اللَّهُ أُمَّةً إِسْتَحَلَّتْ مِنْكَ الْمَحَارِمْ وَانْتَهَكَتْ حُرْمَةَ الْإِسْلَامِ. And may Allah curse that ummah, O Abbas, who by killing you violated the sanctity of Islam. لَعْنَ اللَّهُ أُمَّةً إِسْتَحَلَّتْ مِنْكَ الْمَحَارِمْ. May Allah curse that ummah who by killing you made halal that which was haram and violated the sanctity of Islam. It is very lofty terms that is used for an individual who is generally not counted amongst the 14 Ma'asumeen alayhim as-salam. We are told by the 4th Imam alayhi salam that the pain Imam Hussein alayhi salam felt at the loss of Abbas was the pain the Prophet felt when he lost Hamza at Uhud. He was that close to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. And if you look at the days coming to Karbala and after, you will see how Imam Hussein relies on Abbas. When they get to Karbala, he says, "Oh Abbas, pitch the tents." When they're told to move from Furat, he says, "Oh Abbas, move the tents from the water." When the people come to speak to Hussein, Abbas is the ambassador who goes and asks them. When Hussein wants an extra night to worship, he asks Abbas, "You go ask permission from them." He is the commander. And if you go to Karbala and you go to the place where the tents of the Ahlul Bayt was kept, the place that is called Mukhayyam, you will see that the tents of all the men as well is inside. They will take you inside the Mukhayyam and tell you, this is where was the tent of Imam Zainul Abidin, this is where the tent of Qasim was, this is the tent of Aliun al-Akbar. But the tent of Abbas is right in the front. So he pitched his tent right in front, and he had fought in battle, so he knew the art of battle. He built a trench behind and he lit a fire so they can't attack from behind. And then he pitched his tent right in front. And as long as the women and children knew that Abbas was in front, they had no fear. He was the standard bearer and he was the protector of them. The Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam have a very special place for Abbas. We are told that Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam had specifically asked his brother Aqil, "Find me a woman from a tribe that is known for its valor, a woman that will give me a son who will help my Hussein in Karbala." And therefore, the poet Nayab Halori says, "Abbas tera sani dunya mein kahan mumkin, dunya mein kahan mumkin Abbas tera sani, दुनिया को जो देता है उसने तुझे मांगा है." that, O Abbas, he that gives others, he asked for you. And not only Amir al-Mu'mineen, there are many riwayat that say that Zahra alayhi salam as well, who was not there when Abbas was born, she regards Abbas to be her son. We are told in some of the ahadith of the Imams later on, that on the day of judgment, Rasulullah will ask his daughter Fatima and say, "O Fatima, what have you brought for the shafa'ah of your Shia?" And Fatima will bring the two severed arms of Abbas. And she will say, "These are enough to intercede for all my Shia through all the ages." We are told that there was an alim who once went to the qabr of Abbas, and while reciting ziyarah, he said, "Assalamu alayka ya Abbas, yabna binti Rasulillah." And then he corrected himself. He said, Abbas is the son of al-Baneen. When he slept at night, he saw the mother of Hussein in his dream. She said, "Why did you correct yourself? Abbas is my son." Another alim reports that he used to go for the ziyarah of Hussein 3 times a week and the ziyarah of Abbas once a week. And he saw Sayyida in his dream. She said to him, "O Shaykh, why do you not go for ziyarah of my son?" He said, "O daughter of the Prophet, I go 3 times a week." She said, "Not Hussein. Why do you not go for ziyarah of my Abbas every time you go for ziyarah of my Hussein?" He is precious to the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. He is precious to Zainab alayhis salam. He is a man who is described for his beauty and his strength. The books of Tariq describe him as إنه كان رجل جميل كالجبل العظيم والطود الجسيم. He was a handsome man. He was a towering figure. He looked like a mountain when he moved. And so tall was Abbas that when he sat on his horse, if he so choose, his feet could touch the ground. You can see the kind of inspiration the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam drew from an individual like Abul Fadl al-Abbas. He was not just a man of such stature, he was a learned man. He was an alim, he was a zahid, he was an abid. One of the historians in Karbala says that there was a man on the camp of Yazid who was extremely good looking. And when I saw him much later in Sham, his face had become deformed. And I said to him, "You used to be a very pleasant looking man. What happened to your face?" He said, "When we came from Karbala to Kufa and Sham, I had the head of one of the men of Hussein tied on my horse. And I carried it from Kufa to Sham. He was a man who was an abid and a zahid and an alim. And on his forehead was the mark of sujood, atharis sujood. And his name was Abbas. And it is because of this that Allah has punished me in this manner." So the enemy is describing him as an alim, as an abid, as a zahid. So he's not simply a brave man waiting to fight. He is a man who has surrendered himself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ajrukum ala Allah. I come now to the words of Masa'ib. We are told that Abbas alayhi salam represented the Banu Hashim, but he also represented the whole army. He was the commander of Hussein. And on the night of Ashura, on one occasion, Abbas was on his horse. And the eminent companion of Hussein, Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, saw Abbas and he came to him. He said, "O Abul Fadl, I want to remind you the purpose for which you were born. I want to remind you that your father Ali bin Abi Talib had prayed for you for this day. This is the purpose for which you were created." To which we are told that Abbas was so taken by this. He grabbed the reins of his horse. He pushed his feet on the stirrups until they snapped. And then he said, "Atushajji'uni ya Zubair?" Are you trying to give me shuja'at, O Zubair? wait tomorrow on the day of Ashura, I will show you jihad. But it was not the maslahat of Allah that Abbas should do jihad. It was the maslaha of Allah that Abbas should show taslim the next day. The sun rose on the day of Ashura. Abbas is with Hussein. Abbas is helping Hussein bring the bodies back. He is constantly also asking his Mawla and Aqa, perhaps I should now go for jihad. And Hussein keeps saying to him, no Abbas, you are the alamdar of my lashkar. Oh Abbas, as long as you are there, the women and children feel safe. Oh Abbas, you cannot go for jihad. Oh Abbas, you are the commander of my army. But there came a point when Abbas came and asked his Mawla and Aqa and said, Mawla, perhaps I should now go for jihad. And Hussein said, no Abbas, you are the commander and the alamdar of my lashkar. To which Abbas cried and said, Mawla, where is the lashkar now whose alamdar I am? There is no lashkar left. It is you and I that are left now, Mawla. Hussein does not want this to be a jihad. Hussein does not want this to be a battle. Hussein does not want this to be a reason for the enemies to say Hussein came to take power. If Abbas would go for jihad, history would have been rewritten differently. Hussein says to Abbas that, oh Abbas, I do not permit you for jihad, but the children are thirsty, go fetch some water for them. Some of the Arbab of Azah say that when Abbas was not being given permission to go, then his niece Sakina, the little daughter of Hussein, who is given in the books of history as Ruqayya, but we know her as Sakina, she came running to her uncle Abbas with a water skin that was dry. She said, Ammu Abbas, thirst is killing us, can you not get us some water? And Abbas used the wasta of Sakina to get permission for jihad. When Hussein gave permission to Abbas and said, oh Abbas, you can go but fetch water for the children, Abbas tied the mashkiza of Sakina on his alam. He was about to set out when Hussein said to him, oh Abbas, before you leave, go bid farewell to your sister Zainab, go bid farewell to the women in the Khayyam. Abbas went with his head bowed down before Zainab. Zainab saw her brother Abbas. She knew why Abbas has come. I do not know with what hasrat Zainab let Abbas go. Zainab looked at Abbas and said, Abbas, when I was a child in Kufa, I was one day sitting with my father Ali, and my father said to me, oh Zainab, there will come a day when you will be tied in ropes and you will be paraded in the streets of this Kufa. She said, oh Abbas, then there came a time when you were born. I used to look at you and think, one who has a brother like Abbas, who will dare tie ropes on my arms? Who dares come close to me when I have a brother like Abbas? Oh Abbas, but now I begin to see why this would happen. Go, oh Abbas, fetch water for the children. Now Abbas gets on his horse. Abbas has only one dua on his lips. Ma'bud, help me to bring water for the children of Hussein. Ma'bud, my Sakina is thirsty. I just wish to bring water for this girl. Abbas gets on his horse. He begins to race towards Furat. Sakina brings all the children outside the tent. Come, oh children, Ammu Abbas has gone to fetch water. You do not need to say Al-Atash anymore. Water will now come. The children are watching from the Khayyam. Abbas begins to charge. Umar ibn Saad sees Abbas coming towards Furat. He realizes what is now happening. He had 4,000 men at Furat. He begins fortifying it and brings 10,000 men. They are no match for Abbas. Abbas keeps coming towards them with a spear. He begins to mow them down like a man harvesting a field. From all sides they free Al-Aman, Al-Aman. When Abbas comes into Furat, his alam goes down. Sakina sees the alam going down. She realizes, my Ammu Abbas has reached Furat. Water will now come to us. Abbas steps into Furat. He shows the world, you denied us water. I now have Furat in my control. He takes a cup of the water in his arm, in his hand. He looks at the water in his hand. My heart tells me that Abbas, when he looked at the water, he saw the face of Sakina in the water. Abbas threw the water back into the river. He put the mashkiza into the river. He filled it with water once again. He tied it back and took it up with him. He got on his horse and began racing back. Abbas is now got only one thought in his mind. This water must reach the haram of Hussein. The children are waiting from that side. They see the alam of Abbas rise again. Sakina's hopes have been raised. The children's hopes have been raised. Water is coming at last. Al-Atash, Al-Atash. Abbas is racing towards them. And we are now told that Umar ibn Saad gives out a command and saying, whatever happens, water must not reach Hussein. Surround him from all sides. Stones begin coming towards Abbas. Arrows are thrown towards Abbas. Nothing can stop Abbas. Abbas is going towards the camp of Hussein. Some of the enemies begin to hide behind the trees near Furat. A man comes out from behind. He cuts Abbas's right arm. Abbas's arm is severed. Abbas is still not deterred. He grabs the mashkiza of Sakina with his left arm. Abbas still keeps going. Abbas will not be stopped. Another Shaqi comes from the other side. He severs the left arm of Abbas. Abbas holds the mashkiza with his teeth. Abbas will not stop this day. Abbas needs the water to reach Sakina. Abbas is charging now, holding the mashkiza with his teeth. Hurmala takes an aim for the mashkiza of Sakina. The arrow goes flying towards the chest of Abbas. It pierces the mashkiza and then the chest of Abbas. Now the Arbab of Azaz say, when the water skin tore and the water began pouring out, Abbas turned and went back towards Furat again. I would say, Abbas, you have no arms now. How will you bring more water for Sakina? Abbas turns towards Furat. They surround him from all sides. A Shaqi comes from behind. He brings an iron rod. فَجَاءَ شَقِيٌّ وَضَرَبَهُ عَلَى رَأْسِهِ بِعَمُودٍ مِّنْ حَدِيدٍ. When Abbas cannot hold himself on his horse, he begins to fall and calling out, Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah, ya Akha, Adrik Akhak. Hussein gets on his horse. He begins racing towards Abbas. He begins fighting the enemies. The enemies begin running from all sides, calling out, Al-Aman, Al-Aman. Hussein begins saying to them, Ila ayna tafirrun, wa qad qataltum akhi, wa kasartum dhahri. Where are you fleeing now, O cowards, when you have killed my brother and broken my back? Hussein comes to the banks of Furat. Hussein sees Abbas. When he sees him, Fanadal Hussein, wa akha, wa Abbas. Hussein cannot believe the condition in which he sees his brother Abbas. Hussein sits beside Abbas. Hussein takes the head of Abbas. He places the head of Abbas on his lap. There is an arrow in one eye of Abbas. There is blood on the other eye of Abbas. Hussein gently removes the arrow from one eye. He wipes the blood from the other eye. Abbas opens his eye. When he sees the face of his Aqa and Mawla Hussein, he moves his head immediately away to the hot sands of Karbala. Hussein lifts the head of Abbas. He places the head of Abbas on his lap again. Abbas again moves his head onto the hot sands of Karbala. Hussein again lifts his head and says, Akhi Abbas, why is it that every time I lift your head on my lap, you move it away? Now look at the wafa of Abbas. Abbas says, Mawla, Aqa, everyone who became shaheed, you place their head on your lap. Mawla, in a little while from now, on whose lap will your head be? Where will your head be, O Aqa? I would say, Abbas, do not fear. Fatima is waiting for Hussein. When Hussein falls from the horse, Zahra will hold the head of Hussein in her lap. Hussein begins speaking to Abbas. Abbas begins making his wasiyah. Mawla, I have a wasiyah. What is it, O Abbas? Mawla, do not take my body back to the Khayyam. I do not know if Abbas is worried, how will Hussein lift my body? Why, O Abbas? Mawla, I am ashamed of Sakina. I promised her water. She is still waiting for the water. I do not want Sakina to see me when I do not have water for her. But Abbas's soul left his body. Now the Arbab of Azaz say, فَقَامَ الْحُسَيْن. Hussein stood up. فَنَظَرَ يَمِينًا وَشِمَالًا. Hussein began looking to the right and the left. فَلَمْ يَرَى أَحَدًا يُعِينُهُ. Hussein saw there was no one left to help him now. فَبَكَى بُكَاءً شَدِيدًا. Then he began to cry bitterly, and he placed his hand on his back and said, Abbas, الآن انكسر ظهري. Abbas, my back is broken now. Abbas, Hussein has become gharib now. Bas Hussein took the alam of Abbas and came back to the Khayyam. Alam Aya, Alam Darna Aya. Sakina ran out. Baba, where is my Ammu Abbas? Sakina, don't ask for Ammu Abbas. Ammu Abbas will not come back. Sakina said, Baba, Sakina is not thirsty anymore. Baba, bring Ammu Abbas. Baba, I want Ammu Abbas. I promise I will never ask for water again. Ajrukum Allah. Read the books of Maqtal. After Abbas, no child cried Alatash. But no child stopped crying. Wa Abbasa. Hussein became Shaheed. Everyone cried, Wa Abbasa. The tents were set on fire. The children and women ran from one tent to another crying, Wa Abbasa. Sham-e Ghariba came. Zainab took a broken spear. She turned to Furat and said, Wa Abbasa. Zainab went Darbadar in Kufa. She cried, Wa Abbasa. She was told to enter the majlis of Yazid. She put her foot in saying, Wa Abbasa. When she went back to Medina, she said, Ummul Baneen, my condolences for Abbas. Ummul Baneen used to say, Oh Abbas, when people say to me, you have become Shaheed, I cannot believe that. لو كان سيف في يديك لما دنا منك أحد. Abbas, if you had your sword in your hand, no one would have come near you. But oh Abbas, when people say to me, Zainab's chadar was taken, then I know you were Shaheed, Abbas. Ummul Baneen, she used to draw the grave of Abbas on the sand and cry. Then she would rub it and say, no, I will not cry for Abbas. I will cry for Hussein. But Ummul Baneen is a mother after all. She would say to Zainab, Zainab, when they cut the arms of my Abbas, was he still on his horse? Yes, Amma, Abbas was on his horse. Then she would say, Zainab, when someone falls from an elevation, he first extends his arms. Zainab, how did my Abbas fall from his horse? I would say, Zainab, say to Ummul Baneen, Amma, the day after Ashura, my arms were tied behind my back. When I saw the body of Hussein, I fell on Hussein the way Abbas fell from his horse. Wa Abbasa, wa Ghurbata, wa Madluma, wa Husayna. مات من عباس يا حسين